Alien abductees of Reddit or people who have claimed to see a UFO. What's your story?
I occasionally suffer from sleep paralysis. It developed in my early 20s, and I've had the alien abduction dream. My dad and I loved to watch shows about aliens, so I assume people who claim they were abducted had some form of sleep paralysis. It started with flashes of blue light, and I felt myself being lifted out of bed by the chest. I was blinded by a white light, and I could hear a loud mechanical whirring. When I woke up, I was sitting up in bed with my chest stuck out. My arms were holding me up. The experience was the most intense sleep paralysis dream I've ever had. I can see how someone else could have that dream, panic, and tell everyone about it.
I was traveling back home with my mom from my aunt's house on a warm, sunny afternoon. While I was sitting in the passenger seat, an object just appeared in the sky a little to our left. We both saw it immediately. The size of it is what was shocking more than anything. It had the classic saucer shape and was shining brightly because the sun was reflecting off of it. We continued driving down the road a few seconds, just admiring this craft, when all of a sudden, we saw something I still don't believe to this day. It just vanishes, disintegrates, disappears, whatever you want to call it. I looked back at my mom, and I could tell by her expression she had seen the same thing. Since this sighting, I've always been interested in UFOs and the possibility of other life in our universe. This object in the sky was definitely not a helicopter, airplane, or a flock of geese. My mom and I still talk about the sighting we had and can't come up with a reasonable explanation as to what we saw that day. This is my UFO story, and it is not a hoax or fabrication. Everyone always laughs at me when I tell this story, but that's fine. I know what I saw.
One night I go down to the kitchen to drink water at about 4 a.m., and I hear this weird, kind of low-pitched buzzing sound coming from outside. I go out to the backyard and shit you not, I see this fucking bright rounded object, UFO, hovering about 600 feet right above me. I just froze there. I almost felt like I was paralyzed for a moment. I watched it ascend higher into the air and take off at an incredible speed and disappear into the wintry clouds. That night I had a dream that I was abducted. Now, when I think about it, I wonder if the dream was real but was purposely made to seem like a dream. I obviously don't know for sure, but fucking scary shit, man.
Back in spring of 1997, a group of U.S. neighborhood kids were looking up at the night sky, observing the Hale-Bopp comet. I grew up hours from any major city, so the view was pretty clear. After a while, we started to notice a red and a white dot circling around each other, making sudden movements in every direction. Like no aircraft I have ever seen or have ever seen since. At a certain point, they merged into one craft, then shot out 3 smaller crafts. Although we couldn't tell whether it was a craft because they just appeared to be balls of light. This went on for a couple hours. Right before the lights disappeared, they accelerated at lightning-fast speed into the darkness. We all went home terrified of what we saw. The next day on the front page of our small hometown paper, it said it received several calls. The explanation they gave was that the local airport was testing aircraft. I'm sure how much I believe that story because of what I saw. To this day, whenever I see my friends that were there that night, we'll sometimes talk about it. None of us can be sure what we saw, but to this day, none of us have ever seen anything like it.
I was an air traffic controller, tower, in the Air Force, and one morning, I think it was 1972, and I was the crew chief on duty on a midnight shift along with one other controller. It was daybreak and almost time for shift change, when I look up and there's a metallic object crossing over the field, Randolph AFB, Tex, and moving fast. I couldn't make out what it was, but I knew for sure it wasn't an aircraft. I called down to radar and asked if they had anything on their scope, and they replied, no. The other person who was working with me was sleeping on the floor since it was slow, no traffic at all. All these years later, I still wonder what it was, but it raised the hair on the back of my neck when I was watching it.
I was driving back home to Los Angeles with a friend of mine after visiting family near Phoenix, Arizona. We were headed west on Highway 58, just out of Boron, California, en route to Mojave to catch the 14. It was night, and we were jamming out to some music. The next thing I know, I'm waking up, looking around, and realizing that I was pulled over on the side of the road and that approximately 3 hours had passed. My buddy was fast asleep, so I woke him up, and we both kind of had a psychological meltdown. After we calmed down a little, we went home and never really spoke of it since. I have absolutely no idea when or how we transitioned from listening loud music and driving down the road to waking up safe on the side of the road.
1997, Colorado Springs, CO. I was 8 years old playing in the sand volleyball court at the park down the street from my house. I was engrossed in my activity, burying my collection of Happy Meal toys in the sand and then digging them back out. Repeat. I was looking down, but decided suddenly that I needed to look up because the world around me had lost all sound. There was no longer any ambient noise, no traffic noise from the Busey streets just a block over, no more dogs barking, no more birds chirping. I looked at the street that bordered the park, and that is when I saw it. It looked like a stealth bomber turned sideways, nose leading, one wing down toward the road, and the other pointed up at the sky. Completely shiny black in color, as tall as a house, shaped like an arrowhead. It was cruising the street at 3 mph, just gliding over the road. I watched it for maybe 20 seconds. As soon as it had passed behind some 2-story houses and out of my sight, I got my hearing back full force. I ran home with my piss-soaked pants and never spoke a word of it to anybody. Edit. Here is a quick sketch I made in all of my talented glory. I only lived in CO Springs in 1997. I lived on Don Juan Court, so I guess the park I was playing in was called Franklin Park. Immediately after, I moved back to Phoenix just in time for the Phoenix Lights.
I was about 8 years old when I had the worst nightmare of my life. I was lying in my bed when a dark figure climbed through my bedroom window. I was a master of pretending to be asleep. The perks couldn't be overlooked, missing CCD mass and getting carried in from long car rides and tucked in. So I did the same as I was carried through my window. It felt so surreal. At this point, I realized it was a dream. Eyes still closed, I only had the sensation of ascension. I felt myself stop and opened my eyes to a dark room with reddish lights. I can't properly describe it as it was long ago, in a dreamy state, and plus it was just otherworldly. I felt just a soft pinch on the back of my left hand and the front of my right. Next thing I knew, I was back in my bed with the uncontrollable urge to cry. I ran downstairs to my babysitter and just cried in her arms. She did the classic, "It was just a dream." And obviously, I believed it. It wasn't until the next morning I noticed the scarring on the back of my left hand, as well as the noticeable metal, about the size of a small ball bearing, under the skin of my right palm. The next few years, the metal would often cause my skin to bubble up around it, cause warts, set off metal detectors, and confound every doctor I went to. It was noticeably more irritable in places like church, airports, and next to circuit breakers. I never got it removed because I was scared of being anesthetized, and I kind of liked feeling different having it there. 5 years after the incident, the metal fell out on its own, and now my skin is just slightly grayed there. I believe it was aliens with all my being. I also still have the scar on my left hand, though it has shrunken considerably.